You can find the previous two, which have included Joshua Douglas and Catherine Gill, Daniel Newman, other really terrific, brilliant folks on our website and on our social media feeds. I hope you will also join us here on October 13th for what I think will be a fascinating conversation with Andrew Yang. We are very, very excited for that. We are very excited about what we are going to talk about today as well. Honored and truly thrilled to be joined by our two guests today. One of them is with us right now. The other one will be joining in just a couple of moments after another call. We are all super Zoom scheduled, right? So I grew up in Connecticut in the 1970s and 80s, surrounded by inspiring Northeastern Republicans like Lowell Weicker and Jacob Javits and Christopher Shays and our guest William Weld. They were principled, they were genuine political heroes, and it's a breed and an important voice that I think our system and our nation needs and misses as it's disappeared a little bit. Danielle Allen, meanwhile, is a public intellectual, perhaps without peer, the very model of a brilliant historian who is very devoted to taking these concepts of equality, to applying them to our current moment, building this ethic for everyone, and advocating for these ideals at the highest halls of power as well. There is so much to talk about today from the perspective of a political leader who has sought the highest offices in the land and a thinker who has devoted her work to equality, to justice, and to giving people the tools that they need to reimagine citizenship. We want you to be involved. I will pose the first several questions and then we'll open it up to all of you. If you have questions you would like to ask, please go ahead and use the Q&A and the chat functions below. You can use those at any time now. They are open to you. Our team is monitoring them. Include your name, and we will get to as many as we can. Governor Weld is only going to be with us until about 12:45 today. So if your question is for Governor Weld, I certainly encourage you to get that in early so we might have a chance to pose it to him before he has to move on to his 1 o'clock Zoom call. Let me introduce our two guests more formally. Danielle Allen is the James Bryant Conant University Professor at Harvard University and Director of Harvard's Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics. She is a political theorist who has published broadly in democratic theory, political sociology, and the history of political thought. Widely known for her work on justice and citizenship in both ancient Athens and modern America, Allen is the author of numerous books. She's a former chair of the Mellon Foundation Board, past chair of the Pulitzer Prize Board, and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Philosophical Society. Bill Weld is a former two-term governor of Massachusetts, elected in 1990 with 50% of the vote, and re-elected in 1994 with 71% of the vote. He was the first Republican to be elected governor of Massachusetts in 20 years. Prior to being elected governor, Bill served in President Ronald Reagan's Justice Department, first as the United States Attorney for Massachusetts, where he won 109 convictions and 111 prosecutions of public corruption. I would say that's a very good record, but also too much public corruption. And then as Assistant U.S. Attorney General in charge of the Criminal Justice Division. Earlier in his career as a staff member on the U.S. House Judiciary Committee, he participated in the Watergate impeachment case. So let's get into the questions. Professor Allen, I would really like to jump right into the urgency of this moment in which our national fabric, our common purpose, it all seems to be under tremendous strain. Some might even say that foundation, the foundation of a shared notion of liberty and justice for all, the unwritten norms themselves are crumbling before us. We're in the middle of a pandemic, of a bitterly contested and litigated election, of marches for social and racial justice. Structural political reform, right? It can seem dry, it can seem wonky, maybe even small against a backdrop that is so fevered and important. But could you connect the two for us? Why do we need political reform as the start of repairing our social fabric?
Thanks so much, Dave. Many thanks to you for hosting this event and to FairVote for having this important conversation. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I appreciate that you're starting us off by asking us to focus on urgency, the sense of urgency in the current moment. I do think the degree of urgency we all feel about transformation in our democratic processes is real. We feel it broadly across the country. I've felt urgency for a long time, I'll have to admit, but it used to be that I felt like I had to shake other people and say, look, folks, like we have some really serious problems here. We really have to think about reform to our political institutions to address them. For me, there have been red alarm bells along the way. So for example, in 2013, when Congress's approval rating was at 9%, for me, that was a flashing red alert, right? If that's the first branch, the legislature, it's the people's voice. If the people doesn't approve of its own voice, your constitutional democracy is fundamentally broken. So the good news, is I don't have to shake anybody by the shoulders anymore to say, look, Houston, we've got a problem. It's pretty clear. And so the question is really what to do about it. I've been very fortunate over the last few years to have been a part of a national commission sponsored by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences that focused on the question of the future of our democracy, the reinvention of democracy for the 21st century. It was a group of people who, like me, had acquired a sense of urgency some years ago. And so we got started working on this. And there are about 35 of us from across professional sectors, demographically diverse, ideologically diverse. And we also, most importantly, set up listening sessions all over the country in order to try to hear from people, what do they see as the obstacles to their participation and to the health of our political system. So I'm going to share some of the ideas that came out of that, but I first, again, want to tie it back to the urgency that we face with the pandemic, with the problems in our criminal justice system. On some level, those can seem like different problems, right? One's about health, one's about sanctions and policing and sentencing and things like that. Of course, we've seen links between them with regard to the problems of racial equity. There are massive disparities in mortality with COVID, African Americans, other minorities suffering much worse than white Americans. And of course, those disparities also exist in policing. But there's another thing that links those two fundamentally threatening issues. That's the non-responsiveness of our political institutions. So on policing, it's not as if we're just now figuring out that this is a problem. And it's not even as if it's just now that we're figuring out what the solutions are. Teach police to de-escalate, differences in police training, some body cameras transparency, revisit police accountability, et cetera. There's a list of things that people have been advocating for nearly 2 decades. Relatedly, with regard to the pandemic, we have not, despite the clear need for investment in our public health infrastructure, delivered in the last 6 months the investment that we needed. Why not? There's actually agreement in Congress on what's needed. It's extraordinary between both parties. Behind the scenes, there's actually agreement that we need investment in public health, investment in testing, investment in contact tracing, but the legislation cannot move because our parties are so polarized around issues like voting and things like that. And so the things they actually agree on get entangled in the polarization. So across these two most critical issues, the thing that unites them has been the non-responsiveness of our political institutions, the inability to deliver solutions to our problems. So if we want success substantively in these domains, we have to deliver responsive political institutions for ourselves. And so to your question, Dave, about is this dry, the issue of political reform, structural reform? No, lives depend on it, all right? That's truly where we are. Lives depend on it. And so yes, we do need to deliver responsive institutions. And so the commission that I mentioned, has 6 strategies to deliver responsive institutions that empower people, that provide equal representation, that support people bridging across social differences in civil society, that delivers a media ecosystem supportive of the development of a sense of common purpose in our culture, and then recommendations to nourish and sustain a culture of mutual commitment of Americans to one another and to our constitutional democracy. I've listed all those 6 strategies because solving our problems, achieving those responsive institutions is not a single silver bullet issue. There's not a single silver bullet. We need a virtuous circle linking healthy institutions, healthy civil society, healthy civic culture. So all of those things work together, but then it does mean that for structural reform, the kinds of reforms to focus on are the ones that actually deliver positive effects for institutions, for civil society, and for culture. And so let me now just come to one of our concrete reforms out of our 31, happens to be one of my personal favorites. I know you all care about it too, and that's ranked choice voting. So I'm lucky to be working in Massachusetts on a ballot proposition to deliver ranked choice voting here in Massachusetts. But what I love about ranked choice voting is that it really does help with political institutions, with civil society, and with culture. And can I have 30 more seconds to explain that, Dave?
Oh, absolutely, because I want to delve even deeper into it as we keep going. So absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you all know, I mean, one of the beautiful benefits of ranked choice voting is that nobody takes office without having gotten past that 50% threshold, a majority. So they go into office with a sturdy foundation of legitimacy. That makes governance much more effective, much more possible. It also means that they know that they're always accountable to more than 50% of the electorate. And so they have to think in a problem-solving way that brings us towards the center of our political space, rather than orienting themselves to sort of 25% intense partisan minorities that might be keeping them in office on a first past the post system. So that's a real improvement to our institutions themselves. We populate them with elected office holders who are ready to govern toward the center, towards problem solving. It's also beneficial for civil society, though, because what ranked choice voting can do is draw more candidates into office, or rather, sorry, into candidacy, into running for office, broaden the field. And as the field of candidates is broadened, actually then more civil society organizations begin to participate and engage and find themselves in the work of building coalitions. That's that bridging nexus that we need for a healthy civic culture. And then with regard to culture itself, of course, the other thing that ranked choice voting does is incentivize candidates differently. So candidates now have an incentive to try to earn somebody's second choice vote, their third choice vote, as well as their first choice vote. And that means it's not as much in their interest to demonize their opponents. It's much more in their interest to figure out how to build solidarity, to take, 3 different chunks of the electorate and glue them together. I've heard the analogy that's like a transition from using a kind of, hammer and nail to drive wedges into cracks of concrete to instead using a glue gun to glue parts of the electorate together. And that makes for different campaigning, and the evidence suggests that we do see more positive campaigning in jurisdictions that have changed to ranked choice voting. So that's an example of the reforms we're looking for, where a single reform has positive consequences for institutions, for civil society organizations, and for our culture. That helps to generate the virtuous circle we need for a healthy democracy.
Our common purpose is what you titled this report, and a common purpose is very much what you were describing right there, simply how reinventing the way in which we vote can then trigger an entirely broader change in how we think about our politics, how we even talk to one another, how we build a civic fabric back. You have been not only supportive of ranked choice voting in individual elections. Another one of the proposals that you talk about in our common purpose is what we've called the Fair Representation Act, here involving larger congressional districts, multi-member districts, and members of Congress elected by ranked choice voting inside of those larger districts. I wonder if you might also speak to what the advantages of that approach might be towards inspiring the kind of common purpose and different politics you've imagined.
Absolutely. I mean, as I said, there are 31 recommendations, and they really do span things. So there's a slew of them that are around voting. So I'll go ahead and just tell you more of what some of them are, and then come back to multi-member districts. So ranked choice voting plus multi-member districts. We also advocate universal voting, that is to say, following the Australian model, and indeed introducing mandatory voting. We advocate for the federal election day to be a national holiday, and we recommend Veterans Day as a possibility for that. We recommend automatic voter registration and easier access to voting. So early voting, vote centers, things like that. So if you listen to that package, you'll hear a combination of an advocacy for ease of voting, as well as a sense of civic duty around voting, a sense of public service connected to voting, a sense that it's a civic responsibility for all of us. So there is a sort of redesign of the voting experience that we are looking for with these recommendations. With regard to multi-member districts and the Fair Representation Act, the relevant redesign there is really focused on the equality of representation concept. So if you have a district with multiple members and ranked choice voting, then it's well possible that in many districts you would end up with a team of legislators representing a constituency where those legislators actually come from more than one party. And to represent their constituency, they actually have to collaborate with each other. So it's another mechanism for diminishing polarization, driving our parties and our party structure back in the direction of being problem solvers, able to work together to deliver solutions. They're sort of center of gravity solutions for the bulk of the people in their district or constituency. So across the recommendations, you'll find that we are seeking solutions that bring voices into politics so that, if you take just our major two parties, in a district that's mostly blue, but there's also sizable red population, you would have blue and red voices both in that representative suite and vice versa. Things that look red, but actually have a good chunk of blue would have red and blue voices both working together, so.
You talked about ease of voting. There are some people, including someone you were in conversation with on the Boston Globe's op-ed page not that long ago, that would say that this is too hard. It makes voting harder. I wonder how you respond to that critique when ranking and making choices like this seems to be something we do with ease in our everyday life.
So it is something we do easily all the time without any question. And I think the thing that I find, I have to admit, slightly kind of just give me a chuckle about that question is the ways in which our own current system don't make any sense and we sort of don't notice just because we're so used to it. So let's just take the phrase first past the post, okay? That doesn't actually make any sense. Posts don't move. First past the post should mean you get past 50%. But somehow, for us, first past the post means you might get 22% and win, or 24%, 25%. And we just had a primary here in Massachusetts in our 2nd congressional district where somebody won with, roughly speaking, 23, 24% of the vote. And I will tell you that when I try to explain the two voting systems to my 8-year-old, ranked choice voting, and then this first past the post idea where you can win with 25%, he doesn't get the second one. It doesn't make any sense to him. Ranked choice voting makes perfect sense. My first choice, my second choice, my third choice, and then as the choices fall down, they bundle up till somebody actually gets past the real post, which is a real majority. So at any rate, I am fortunate to be in a city that uses ranked choice voting, and my experience is that there's broad participation. People do not have a problem learning about enough candidates to be able to rank their top numbers of choices. You don't have to rank absolutely everybody, and it's a misperception that that's the case. So at any rate, yes, I do think we see success. And the primaries this summer in Maine give good evidence of voter success. And I think you guys did a study about the Maine election that show something 98% of people managed to rank their top 3 choices. That is in a higher than average turnout election. So that is a strong indication that voters can indeed manage this approach.
In addition to voting, what are some of the other key recommendations of the Academy report that you might want?
Sure. Well, let me share some of my favorites. One is that Supreme Court justices should have term limits of 18 years so that a justice is appointed every 2 years. Every president would have 2 appointments per term. So there would be dynamism to the court. We would lower the stakes around the appointments to the court, and we wouldn't find our presidential elections sort of tangled up by the politics of the court. Another one is to enlarge the House of Representatives. This is a particularly important one because it also impacts the Electoral College and is a way of reweighting the balance in the Electoral College so that the minority protecting mechanism, which delivers a little bit of extra protection to less populous states, is back into the kind of balance that makes sense for the sort of stable equilibrium of a constitutional democracy. So those are other good examples in the political reform space. As I mentioned, we're also really interested in the civil society and the culture space. So on the civil society front, we do argue that we should invest in civic media, use of technology and media tools to fill the news deserts that currently populate many municipalities, even state politics, and that we should use taxes on advertising revenue from social media companies to deliver resources to fund civic media. That would be an example in that space. And in the cultural space, we're really eager to see networks of civil society organizations, for example, state and territorial humanities councils, fostering experimental conversations all over the country about how we narrate our shared American story. So much of our polarization comes from the fact that we just are having this very bitter fight about whether we tell, in the words of the historian Jill Lepore, the gory or the glory story of America, the enslavement story and the genocide for Native American story, or the story of our innovations, the triumphs of constitutionalism, and so forth. Both of these are part of the American story, and we have to find a way of integrating them into a single story that we can collectively share. That, though, should be a project of experimentalism across this great land where, you know, we are an amazing people. I believe we can solve this problem of how we find a way of telling a shared story if we put our minds to it and start experimenting.
That's exactly right. 3 cheers. Governor Weld, thank you for joining us. And I think you might be on mute there. You have endorsed the ranked choice ballot amendments that are on the ballot in Massachusetts and Alaska this fall. I was just hoping you could tell us the story of how you came to support RCV. And I wonder specifically, as someone who has won election and governed in a blue state, as someone who has sought the presidency, been active in our politics at the highest levels, how this might re-incentivize how politicians run for office and then behave in office once elected.
You know, David, I've experienced ranked choice voting for 25 years in that I lived in Cambridge from 1975 to 2000. And they have proportional representation / ranked choice voting for the Cambridge City Council, which is 9 members. So I'm very much used to this. And it was really kind of a smorgasbord. Ranked choice voting encourages all kinds of different people to run for office because they know anything could happen if they develop a devoted following who's going to, you know, rank them #1 in the 9-member Cambridge City Council. They've got a shot there, and that the proof of the pudding is in the eating. That panned out that way. I was on the panel earlier with Danielle, and I said if you took a photograph of the Cambridge City Council, 9 members, generally there were 5 liberals and 4 conservatives, or the other way around, and it was a salad of racial genes. And many times somebody would be a graduate student in their early 20s and they get elected to the Cambridge City Council because what they said made sense, and they kind of took up, they became a cause, and anybody can win. So that's a good thing. It attracts people to run for office, which is a good thing. And beyond that, to me, the overwhelming advantage of ranked choice voting is it disfavors people who are running as extremists, hyperpartisans. Because if you do what Donald Trump is doing right now, saying, I have no interest in expanding beyond my base of flag-waving zealots or whatever your base is, I'm just going to go with my core, you're not going to win in a ranked choice voting scenario because candidates under RCV have to appeal to the supporters of other people, of other candidates, or they're going to run out of gas unless somebody gets 51% in a 9-person primary on round 1, in which case, God love them, more luck to them. And it traces my history in politics. I began, my first job was working for Jack Javits, senator from New York in Washington. And that was, I hadn't even been to law school. And that was the time when lions still strode the earth in the Senate. And if someone was giving a big speech in the Senate, the galleries would be filled, the Senate galleries. No one knows they're there anymore because all the speeches are given at 3 in the morning. But people wanted to hear the speech and see whether they would be persuaded. That never happens in today's Washington. And the villain is hyperpartisanship. And part of that is redistricting. So that there's safe districts. The people doing the redistricting want to save their own. So they create safe districts where you're going to lose your seat only in a primary, which in turn drives people further to the right among the Republicans and further to the left among the Democrats. And we've had, for many years in this country, what has come to be called the duopoly, the dominance of the Democratic and Republican parties. I happen to think that's something that's outlived its usefulness, and I can prove that I think that because in 2016, I ran for vice president as the Libertarian candidate. And Gary Johnson, my running mate, he and I have been Republican governors together. We ran against the duopoly. We said we are two 19th century Jeffersonian liberals. We are fiscally conservative, and we're both can prove we're fiscal conservatives from how we govern, and we're socially welcoming and tolerant, liberal, whatever word you want. On immigration, we are welcoming. On abortion, we are pro-choice, but we don't rub anybody's nose in it. That's just our analysis, and so on. And we thought we were going to have a 6-lane highway right up the middle, because fiscally conservative and socially tolerant and moderate describes most of the people I know in the Northeast part of the United States. But no way. We were excluded from the presidential debates. And at the end of the day, everyone thought, well, we have to go back and do the same thing that mommy and daddy and Grammy and grandpa did. But I think that would not be the case if we didn't have this hyper-partisanship. So I'm all for ranked choice voting to undermine that from an electoral point of view. I'm all for independent commissions to draft the redistricting resolutions, and I subscribe to virtually everything that Professor Allen has said, except maybe for mandatory voting. Libertarians don't like anything mandatory.
Yeah, no, that one's not likely to sit well with you. But on the other hand, on that subject, just consider this, right? This is actually the best way of taking money out of politics, because so much, and I'm not saying we do have other campaign finance reform measures in our recommendations, but if you have universal voting, then no longer do people need to invest as they do in get out the vote, and even more significantly, suppress your adversary's vote. That is, all the energy and resources poured into that go off the table.
So I see all that. I mean, I'm fixated on Washington right now, and we have gridlock down there because of hyperpartisanship. Nobody will reach across the aisle generally, and that's a disaster. And, you know, I was elected, narrowly elected governor in Massachusetts, a very Democratic state, 4-1 Democratic. And so perhaps I had no choice, but my instinct anyway was to act like those senators when I first broke into politics and reach across the aisle. I mean, Ted Kennedy and Orrin Hatch not only were best of friends, they did a lot of stuff together. And so I made it my business I went to the House Speaker and the Senate President. I said, why don't we have tea and cookies every Monday at 3:15? Mr. Speaker, we'll start in your office, and then Mr. President will go to your office. And I didn't even say the third time will come to my office, because legislators hate being summoned to the governor's office. So we did that for both of my terms, and it was so successful in that we never had an open break with each other, because if you're going to be having tea and crackers with somebody within the next 7 days, it's a lot harder to go stab them in the back with the press or stab them in the front. And it's so successful that they do it to this day. Charlie Baker, who is now a cabinet member, was a cabinet member for me twice, is now the governor, and he and the Speaker and the Senate President pursue this to this day. And it was done during Governor Patrick, who's a Democrat, in between us. So that's what they need in Washington, and any reform, any political reform that would help to chip away at that cement duopoly, I think would be a good thing.
There was a time when New England states regularly elected Republicans to the House, to the U.S. Senate. We talked at the beginning about Senator Javits, Senator Weicker, of course, you in Massachusetts twice.
Well, they were all of my friends. Chris Shays was my best friend in politics.
Shays.
Nancy Johnson from Connecticut.
Right.
And I just watched them get picked off one by one by one. And
What's
it's
been
because
lost
of hyperpartisanship.
What's been lost in our politics as a result of that? And how do you think RCV might work as a palliative?
To the hyperpartisanship?
Yes.
Well, you're disincentivized to take hyperpartisan positions, because I gave everybody a tickle in the last presentation Danielle and I made. I said, well, let's suppose we had ranked choice voting at the presidential level. When Gary Johnson and I, fiscally conservative, socially liberal, ran against Hillary Clinton and Donald J. Trump, how many second choice votes do you think either of them would have gotten? The answer is none. So, you know, it would have been an interesting experiment living under President Gary Johnson, Vice President Bill Weld. but that's an extreme, almost fanciful example, but it shows you what a difference it would make.
Yeah. Let me throw one more at you, Governor Weld. I know you have to leave us early for another call, but
I'm good for another 10 minutes.
great. I mean, along those lines of the next presidential campaign, we might well have wide open presidential primaries on both the Democratic and the Republican sides in 2024 without any incumbent on the ballot. You might see 24 candidates on both sides. It's really easy to imagine 2 plurality nominees, 2 conventions that are maybe even brokered. What reforms would you propose to the presidential primary process? What did you learn from your run, from the canceled primaries, about how the system should be different? You had 5 states that involved RCVs in their primaries and caucus this year. I wonder if ranked choice voting might play a role in how you reimagine the presidential process as well.
If you could do it, you'd want it at both the primary and the final, because the ill that we have to cure here is hyperpartisanship in Washington. By and large, the states are getting along okay. Couple of exceptions, but and it's because that the people who are elected at the state level, governors, state legislators, they're right under the thumb of those voters every single day. Whereas if they're 2,000 miles away, the connection is not quite so strong, so voters don't keep tabs on them quite so closely. So people get away with murder, in my opinion, in Washington, and not minding the people's business, just minding their own political fights instead. But if you could ever persuade people that we want to have ranked choice voting in the primaries, that would be terrific. In the general, you might get President Gary Johnson, which would be kind of a surprise for a lot of people the first time around, but people would approach the race differently, and I think a lot more seriously with the public interest in mind.
Professor Allen, we're all straddling a line between optimism and pessimism, I think, as we look at the news. Let me turn this question around a little bit. What happens if we fail in this moment to enact the kind of reforms we need to reimagine our democracy? How urgent a moment is this?
It is urgent. I'm often asked, why are you optimistic that we can change this? And what I actually say is, it's not really for me about optimism or pessimism. It's for me simply the fact that failure is not an option. I am 100% clear on the fact that a healthy, functional constitutional democracy is the best path for human flourishing.
Let my doggy out.
That is, it's the best way in which people are empowered to shape their own lives in the direction of their fulfillment and to contribute to shaping a collective life, communities' decisions in ways that are supportive of human fulfillment and satisfaction. So we each need a healthy constitutional democracy. Failure is not an option. So what happens, if we don't succeed? Having said that, honestly, I think, we already know. We're living it right now. We started out this conversation with points about the non-responsiveness of our political institutions to the pandemic, the fact that there's been actually shared understanding in both parties of Congress since the middle of the summer about what we need, and yet they have not been able to move legislation. We started out with the issue of police brutality and the fact that for a decade and a half, people have had a clear understanding of the changes that we need in policing, and yet we are not able to actually deliver those transformations. So we are a society where we can achieve common purpose. What we can't do at the moment is execute on that common purpose. So we actually already know what it looks like to fail. We're living in it right now, 200,000 dead from the pandemic and ongoing set of problems with police brutality, and we can go on down the line. So it's time for change, and failure is not an option.
We have a question along those lines from John W., who asks, ranked choice voting makes so much sense on so many different levels. Why is it so hard to drive adoption? I wonder if both of you perhaps could speak to sort of what you've seen amidst this current campaign in Massachusetts that has worked as strategies, how this connects with people, with politicians, and how we can make this kind of change enacted and real.
Well, as so often, the attack is just a bunch of untruths. They say voters get confused. That's not true. They say it reduces incentives for people to participate. That's the opposite of my experience over 25 years voting in Cambridge. We would all get together after voting and say, isn't this great? And can you believe that candidate over there? And it was just the essence, the best thing about parliamentary, about pure democracy. I would say one other thing, David, and I think Danielle touched on it, but if we could get a system, and this might be easier to do than ranked choice voting at the presidential level, if we could move to a system at the congressional level of multi-candidate districts, that would be very good in terms of reducing the winger versus winger result that we too often get in congressional races now.
I'm glad you brought that up. So you would back larger multi-member districts and some sense of ranked choice voting to be used there as far as a more proportional system for—
Those are two political reforms, and the third is independent commissions to take over redistricting. And if you get those three, you're on your way. But in terms of how big the threat is absolutely fundamental, and it's because of the person in the White House now who's made very clear that he wants to overthrow our system of elections. A more treasonous approach to an issue I cannot imagine. But the man seems to have no shame and no ability to think about anything except himself. So it's very important. And I was happy with the debate the other night because I thought his behavior was so beyond the call that people are going to be able to see that. And I certainly hope that the Commission on Presidential Debates, they've said they need more structure for their future debates. One political reform I can think of is to only allow one candidate to have the microphone on while speaking. Both candidates,
Exactly.
but only one at a time.
Yep, here to
fundamental
that.
Reform.
Yeah, exactly. I'd like to add something, if you don't mind, about sort of the issue of urgency and how to think about what the stakes are. And this relates to the relationship between the non-responsiveness of our institutions, the polarization, the gridlock, as the governor said, and generational succession, what it means for one generation after the next to love democracy, to be able to understand it and operate it. And I think many have by now seen the really stark data that contrasts older generations of Americans to people age 40 and below, where those who were born before World War II, of that cohort, 70% alive today consider it essential to live in a democracy. For people age 40 and below, that number is just under 30% who consider it essential to live in a democracy. And at a very rudimentary level, you can't have a democracy if people don't want it. So if we're not actually passing from one generation to the next, a sense of connection to and commitment to democracy, it will simply disappear. And it's really, really important that this is not about exhorting young people to participate or exhorting them to a sort of sturdier sense of civic duty. They're actually making an accurate judgment about the failure of our current institutions to deliver on really important issues. And for them to, of course, climate change is at the core of that. So in order for us to rebuild the affection of a rising generation of Americans to constitutional democracy, we have to give them something worthy of their affection.
Gregory asks along those lines, will the speakers please offer their sense of the citizen action that is most needed right now? Perhaps Governor Weld is your last question before I know you have to take off.
I think the citizen action that's most required is to make a lot of noise about how we want people in Washington to cooperate. And I would draw a distinction between Washington and the states, because we don't want total council of despair. And I think the real problem in this country is in Washington, D.C., and it's a result of hyperpartisanship, which came from the things that Danielle and I have been talking about. It began with the election in 1994. Ever since that election, which was an overwhelming triumph for Republicans, people of the representatives and senators have been going further and further to the fringes. And I think that should be identified as a major ill. But I really can't go on without mentioning that a lot of the problem in Washington stems from one man, one person. And can you imagine anyone else in the United States saying, we really have to do away with our system of free elections because it's just, it's a hoax. It's like the idea that the atmosphere is getting warmer. It's just a hoax. We gotta, I'm so sorry to say that I think vote for Biden is the order of the day right now if you want a political reform.
Thank you for joining us, Governor. We are so grateful for your work in Massachusetts, Alaska, and for your voice and vision and leadership on all of these important issues. So thank you very much. We look forward to being in touch and doing more of this. We have another question, Professor Allen, from Martin, who asks about how the debate laid bare that elections in the United States fail the public because they are not one system, but an assortment of arbitrary procedures in every state, and that they can be manipulated by incumbents. And he wonders if there's any hope to create a unified elections process across states. And I wonder if that's something that you've thought about or touched on, as we see all the different rules in so many different states on ballot access or registration issues, or absentee ballot laws. If there's a way to make that somehow more standardized, or if that's not possible.
Well, I think I would have three important things to say there. I mean, the first is to echo what Governor Weld said, which is that on the whole, politics in our states is much healthier than politics in Washington, D.C. That doesn't mean there aren't problems. Obviously there are, and some of the voter suppression challenges are very much state level challenges. So I want to acknowledge that. Nonetheless, we should recognize that where there's health in our system, it's in states. And so we really need to build on that and capture that. That's the first point. The second point is to say that I think it's actually, we're due for a rethink of the concept of federalism. And by that, I don't mean abandoning it. Federalism is immensely valuable, and its valuable comes in the fact that it allows us to be tailored and flexible for the diversity of the population and contexts. But we have developed a misconception, a misunderstanding that federalism basically amounts to sort of states, leaving states to do their own thing. That's not even actually what the original idea of federalism was. The original idea of federalism was that it was actually the job of the national government, the federal government, to harmonize, that's the language of the Federalist Papers, harmonize the interests of the state and to harmonize the interests of the states in the direction of the national interest. So I think that there's room for the development of a concept my colleagues and I are calling collaborative federalism that really focuses on this concept of harmonization. And in an important way, I think some of the recommendations in the report I mentioned, Our Common Purpose, really head in that direction. So for instance, we are recommending automatic voter registration. At the end of the day, the secretaries of state of every state needs to deliver that. But how can the federal government help? The federal government can help by supporting best practices, by disseminating best practices. Many of our policy challenges across the country right now are data challenges. The fact that people have very different kinds of infrastructure for handling data relevant to policymaking. The federal government can help by building sort of data infrastructure that can be used across the country. So states can then still nonetheless make their own decisions and tailor things to their specific contexts, but do so on the basis of a foundation of data infrastructure that has built into it sort of best practices that have been developed on a research basis. So there is room for us to improve processes nationally, but it doesn't require a kind of top-down centralized conception of how you achieve it. Instead, it requires this orientation towards harmonization and collaborative federalism.
We also have a question about automatic voter registration and whether there's a way to do automatic voter registration that doesn't also involve a national ID card.
Well, this is exactly what I was just talking about. So that's a perfect question. So what I am suggesting is that, yes, there is a way to do it in a way that does not involve a national ID card. That is, we don't have to federalize elections in order to have automatic voter registration. What we have to have is this collaborative approach to federalism, where the federal government builds a consistent infrastructure that all the states can use. And then we can actually have automatic voter registration across states in a way that harmonizes and is consistent and permits them to clean up electoral rolls in relationship to each other as people move. The right metaphor really is to think about the interstate highway system. We needed the federal government to help design the infrastructure of that interstate highway system, but at the end of the day, states have a huge role to play in the shape of that system within their state, the specific pathways, the networks, and then maintenance over time, as well as obviously traffic control on that section of the interstate highway system. So, so yes, we don't need a national voter ID to do it.
We we will get these changes once we convince the public, but we'll also get these changes once we convince policymakers and politicians that they are important. And Alejandra asks about California, about how Governor Newsom has vetoed an RCV-related bill there, using some of the same rationale you and the governor mentioned that you have countered over the course of the initiative in Massachusetts. And Alejandra wonders what strategies and tactics you might recommend for the kind of high-level policymaker education to begin to move the needle at that level.
So I appreciate that, and this relates to Greg's question earlier as well. So in addition to the governor's broad recommendations for near-term action, I think I would point to a couple of other really specific things. The report I keep mentioning, has proven of interest to people. So it's been downloaded, or it's been, I guess we've sent out more than 12,000 hard copies, and it's been downloaded about 15,000 times. So this is a report that even merits book group attention. So if you're a part of a book group, have your book group read this report. Make sure all of your elected officials in whatever whose constituent you are have this report. Check in on them. Have they read it? Have they processed it, et cetera? So I think we can collectively drive a conversation that educates decision makers. That's thing number one. Thing number two is that we do have, for all of the 31 recommendations in our report, a network of champions. FairVote is one of our wonderful champions, for instance. And the champions are doing amazing work to move these recommendations forward. So I would really encourage you to visit the website and identify a champion that you want to join or donate to or participate in their events and spread the word about their events. So we can take the network of champions that exists and build on it and really build out a nationwide grassroots reform movement.
Absolutely. I would join that book club. That would be an excellent book club. I'd love to end this with a call for optimism and the kind of renewed civic spirit that we need going forward. So I wonder what you say to that person who says, yeah, but the system is so broken right now. I don't know if my vote even matters, or why should I vote when I need to be working on these other, I'm out protesting, social justice issues that seem much more central and real than voting. If voting worked, I wouldn't have to be doing that. Or to people who just feel down and discouraged about the moment, could you send us off with a sense of optimism and uplift about what the vote can do to reinvigorate a democracy and our very common purpose?
So my basic message is lift the rock. It's time for all of us to lift the rock. We all feel completely squashed down, mushed down by the nature of politics in this moment, by the divisiveness, by the non-responsiveness, the urgent problems that need solution that aren't acquiring a solution. And we do have a tool. It's our vote. We can make our tool stronger by changing how the vote works. So vote and change how the vote works, and we can lift the rock and start actually making progress together to solve the problems we have and get us back to a place where life feels good, where we can connect with friends and neighbors in a sense of safety, not feel threatened if we're a person of color walking around public space, feel healthy and not worried about maybe catching something or not having access to healthcare to deal with our health issues. But we have to lift the rock that's pressing us down, and the rock that's pressing us down is political institutions that don't work. So we've got to lift the rock.
Everybody grab onto that rock. That is a beautiful metaphor, and I think very important for all of us to hear in these days. I want to thank Professor Allen for spending this hour with us. I want to thank Governor Weld. I want to thank both of you for your work on 2. If you are in Massachusetts, it is yes on 2. This would be the hashtag or the
Exactly.
yes, right?
Yes on 2.
Yes on 2, everybody.
Thumbs up on 2. We're doing it this way around.
Whichever way Zoom goes. Thanks to both of you for just a very inspiring and informative talk. I want to encourage all of you to join us here again as well on October 13th, when we will be joined by Andrew Yang, which ought to be fascinating. And you can learn about all of these events, and you can find recaps and videos of them all and sign up for them on our social media feeds. So I want to encourage you to head over to @FairVote and also follow us and like us over on Facebook so you can see all of this. I want to thank the FairVote team and Emily and everybody on the other side of this Zoom call for your work in putting this together. And I want to encourage you all to lift that rock. Thank you, everybody. This has been terrific, and we will see you on the 13th. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dave. Take good care.